So good evening, everyone. My name is Casey Neely, and I'm the program coordinator for USJETAA, which is the U.S. Japan Exchange and Teaching Program Alumni Association. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C., and our mission is to further the U.S.-Japan relationship as well as supporting alumni of the JET program. I was also a JET in Kumamoto Prefecture from 2013 to 2015. And all of our speakers as well were also JET and are JET alumni. I'm very excited to welcome them to this webinar. Our speakers today are Kate Emory. She is the International Student Service Coordinator at Chatham University. Ned Khatrichettri, who is the Internship Coordinator at the University of Utah. And Adam Lisbon, who is a professor and librarian at the University of Colorado Boulder. Before we get started with the webinar, there's a couple of things that I'd like to mention. I would like to let you know about some of our upcoming virtual events. We have webinars, 1 to 2 webinars every month. Our upcoming webinar for August is on a new scholarship that we have with the School of International Training. And that's a scholarship for JET alumni. So if you are interested in graduate school, I would definitely encourage you to check that out. They have a lot of programs in international relation, intercultural relations, as well as public health and things like that. And that will be, there will be 2 sessions for that. That'll be on August 11th and August 13th. We are also doing a webinar on August 20th on careers using Japanese. So if you're interested in either one of those topics, I would definitely encourage you to check those out. They'll be on our website, and if you have signed up to become a member of USJETAA, you will also get an email about those webinars. If you are a JET alumni, we would definitely encourage you to become a member of USJETAA. It's completely free, but you can also donate to USJETAA if you like programming like this, as it helps to support further programming. Before I turn it over to our speakers, I'm just going to do some brief housekeeping. See if we can go to the next slide real quick. So if you have questions while our speakers are talking, please feel free to use the chat function at the bottom of your screen or the Q&A feature. And we will not be using the raise hand feature, but we will be using the chat box in the Q&A. And if you are tuning in on mobile, it'll also be at the bottom of your screen, but you might have to tap or double click on your screen to see those options. So definitely feel free to ask questions at any time, and we will be answering all of your questions at the end of the webinar. Lastly, I just want to remind everyone that this webinar will be recorded. So if you know of anyone that couldn't make it to the webinar, or you're not able to see the webinar to the end, still ask your questions, and we'll be sending it out to everyone and also posting it on YouTube so that you can view it later. Okay, now without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers.
All right, so welcome everyone to our webinar on higher ed. For the agenda today, we're going to go through our introductions, kind of go through a general summary of the higher education landscape, some options regarding what you should look into for graduate school if you are interested in working in higher ed, tips and tricks for interviewing. And then we will go through our own personal trajectories on how we went from the JET program to where we are now. And then following up with some action items that you can start working on if you are interested in a career in higher ed, or you're already in higher ed and are looking for a different field. And then we'll follow up with our questions. As Casey said, if you have questions at any point during the webinar, please type them into the chat box and we will cover them at the end. If you're unable to stay for the entirety of the webinar, please still ask your questions. Also at the very end, we have the panelists' contact information. So if there's something that we say that you're in particular interested in, please feel free to contact us. All right, so first we'll do some introductions.
Okay, just unmuted myself. Hello, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Ned Khatrichettri. I was a Kobe Jet from '05 to 10. I currently work as an internship coordinator for the College of Humanities at the University of Utah. And prior to this role, I worked as an academic advisor at a university in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And prior to that, I worked as a study abroad advisor at a tiny private liberal arts college in North Carolina. And when I'm not working, I enjoy tennis, indoor cycling, and jogging. Again, thank you for joining us.
Okay, hello. I'm Kate Emory. I was an ALT in Hyogo Prefecture on Awaji Island in Minamiawaji-shi, which is closer to Tokushima than it is to Kobe, but island life is the best life. I'm currently the International Student and Scholar Service Coordinator for Chatham University in Pittsburgh. Right now, I do a lot of immigration advising as well as American cultural advising. I work with exchange programs. We have 8 in Japan that I work with students on. And then I also am the point of contact on our campus for international students and when faculty have questions about cross-cultural communication. Previously, I worked as a study abroad advisor, did a lot of temp work, but made it to where I am now. And my hobbies are travel, haven't been doing a lot lately, baking and visiting museums. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Adam, and I was a Kobe Jet 2004 to 2007. And so kind of coincidentally, all of us were in the Kobe Hyogo region. So I am a professor and librarian at the University of Colorado Boulder. And I also I've just become tenured as well, which is roughly a 7-year process at most universities. So that was a big career milestone just a few weeks ago. So I'm actually in charge of Japanese and Korean collections. And although I'm a professor, I actually don't have a PhD and I don't even have a second master's. I just have a master's in library science, or specifically a master's in science and information science. And so really the cornerstone of my entry to this career is actually my JET experience that I have marketed over the years and sort of use that to always be the guy who knew a lot about Japan and East Asia, and that became a career in academia. Before I worked in an academic library, I did work in a public library while I was in graduate school, and before that, I was trying to figure my life out, and I was doing retail work and teaching ESL in San Francisco, and we'll get a bit more into kind of that experience. But as of now, as a 7-year Colorado resident, I'm really into ultra running, and when I'm recovering from 100-kilometer marathons, I play a lot of video games. So happy to be here and talk to y'all.
So if I were to think of one word that would best describe the higher ed landscape, I'd have to say complex, okay? The structure is pretty expansive. So for example, you have community colleges, technical colleges, vocational schools, public research institutions, highly selective private liberal arts colleges, not so highly selective private liberal arts, and of course, Ivies. And there's so many subsets within higher ed that you can focus on, student facing as well as non-student facing. For example, for the first portion, faculty, obviously teach, research, publish, okay? Academic advising, strong student facing, work with students to figure out their majors, minors, resolve any issues that they're experiencing during their collegiate experience. Residential life staff, these are professionals that live in the dorm rooms that facilitate quite a few programming events for community and cultural integration. International education, that includes study abroad advising as well as international student advising. Financial aid, how do students get situated with certain scholarships? How do you navigate the whole FAFSA process? Admissions and enrollment, this is primarily for prospective students and families, okay? But nevertheless, student facing. Career services, what I'm involved with. Again, my area is pretty specialized in terms of internships, but also quite a few non-student facing opportunities. For example, lawyers. Colleges and universities, they need them. Graphic designers, someone's got to take care of the website. That includes IT. Facility managers, all universities have lots of buildings. Someone's got to be in charge of taking care of them. Communications and marketing and public relations, and of course, human resources and accounting, business offices. Every department requires one. And last but not least, development. It's basically another word for fundraising, okay? What colleges and universities doesn't want more money, right? So how can you learn about the different kinds of schools or various areas of student affairs? One best way, to whatever school you're interested in, take a look at their website, go to that specific department, request informational interviews from people that are currently involved in whatever area that you're interested in. And another great way to start networking, getting involved is volunteering at conferences, okay? And again, reading through the websites. And of course, there are plenty of professional organizations devoted to both student-facing and non-student-facing areas that have lots of resources, annual reports, publications, blogs, things along those lines. So the last bullet point here, the challenges in higher ed, politics, hierarchy, and pace. And let me start with the last one, pace. Unlike the corporate world, it's just that time is money, mind frame is not applicable, okay? Pace in higher ed is very, very slow. There's tremendous added value to that, but it's also incredibly frustrating, especially when you're trying to get situated with a role. Okay, for example, my first role in higher ed, from the day I hit that submit button for the online application to my first day on the job, 6 months. It is what it is, okay? And again, the pace ties into the politics and hierarchy because usually it takes at least 1 year, and depending on the size of the school like mine, undergrad total is like 37,000. It'll take at least 2, if not 2.5 years to figure out the culture, the system, the hierarchy. But the key thing is to just listen, observe, ask questions during appropriate times, and of course, build relationships. This ties in more to the politics and hierarchy, but it's critical to just stay in your lane, okay? And you'll have a better idea of what your lane is by, again, forming those relationships and figuring out what your colleagues' primary area of responsibility is and isn't, okay? And a lot of what I've been able to do in terms of literally institution hop in the US is from my experiences in the JET program. Being there, just when I got used to one school, I had to change to another one. So I had to figure out, all right, who's the Kyoto sensei? Who's the Kocho sensei? What does the hierarchy look like? Who are the alpha males and females in each class? A lot of that is just, again, listening, observing, asking questions during appropriate times. So I've been able to take all of those lived experiences, acquire them, and then literally put them into use in different cultures and systems within the US higher ed landscape, because literally every college and university, it's its own culture.
And I'll piggyback off what Ned was saying, especially about observing. Higher ed is just a very complex place with a lot of interwoven systems. And so especially within your direct unit, so my direct unit, there's 170 of us. And so it was really important to kind of understand, you may want a mentor or a buddy, something like that, but you got to kind of figure out the who's who, because you don't want to necessarily align with somebody that's largely disliked. Like, I don't mean to be cynical, but like there are local politics that you're walking into that you're not told about. And often when a new employee is brought in, no one really is going to tell you about that. So you kind of have to feel the situation out. If you're lucky, your institution will have an onboarding program that will structure in socializing you with your colleagues and sort of getting you familiar with how things operate. That may not exist though. And if that's the case, you have to be really capable of sort of onboarding yourself and getting yourself to like ask questions of the right people, working with your supervisor and things like that, and making sure that you kind of don't overstep your bounds and sort of learn like what projects are already happening, that you're not reinventing wheels and things like that. Keeping those things in mind really makes for a much smoother transition experience.
And to build off of this as well, we mentioned a lot of different roles that are involved in higher ed. If you're interested in a very unique position, you're already going to know who you're going to talk to, what types of universities may have that position. But if you're more general, that you want to work in higher ed or you want to build experience to get to that level of the role that you want, there are many opportunities to take a job that you're not that interested in, but will get your foot in the door to have those 2 to 5 years experience in higher ed. When I first started, I had a great job, but it was part-time, and I started doing admissions, and admissions has incredible turnover because people don't last long, and they don't last long because it's very hard, but it gets you in the door. And many of the people who go from admissions will go to other university departments because they already have shown their mettle in that role, and they have then the years and the experience behind them to move to a different department. So, you know, if you really want to have a student-facing role, but there's only a position that's non-student facing, build your repertoire and your experience if you're able to get your foot in the door, and then transition from there into the role that you're interested or that you're aiming to get.
Just to echo off that, I mean, my first role in higher ed, study abroad advising, then I did academic advising, and now internship coordinating within career services. I don't know about you guys, but like I have yet to meet someone who started at an entry-level role, then worked all the way up to director in that same department, whether it's, again, admissions officer, then like became the director of an admissions office. So despite how slow higher ed is, there's always lots of movement. And spring term is just a lot more movement because, again, people are making big life changes during the summer. It's easier for the colleges and universities to make certain onboarding adjustments in the summer than actually during the year. Okay, next slide, please. Graduate school. I don't want to spend too much time on this because I understand USJETAA already created a YouTube video about it, but a couple of things I do want to mention. Master's degree, it's critical, okay? It's basically your ticket in. Depending on, again, whether it's student facing or non, you may be required to get a specific degree in X, Y, and Z area. Or for something like development, even an MBA would be appropriate, okay? Or a master's in whatever you're interested in. And something like international ed, you know, master's in a second language, or higher ed administration, something along those lines. But again, it varies with whether or not student facing or not, and the school too. Okay. For faculty, PhD, master's in library science, MFA. In community colleges, PhD may not be necessary, but again, that all depends on the community college. Casey mentioned JET specific alumni scholarships through certain programs. Absolutely. If you don't know whether or not X, Y, and Z grad program offers the scholarships for JETs alumni, just ask, okay? In addition to JET, if you're an AmeriCorps alumni, which I am, but my education award was not applicable to grad school. Anyway, Peace Corps, Fulbright, Teach for America, and others, okay? When in doubt, just ask. It never hurts to ask. Also, when you explore, you know, potential grad programs, it's always good to get in touch with people who've gone through that grad program. Hey, what were the pros? What were the cons? Not just the academic curriculum, but in terms of quality of life, geography. And we throw that out because, again, SIT, you know, highly reputed program, but it's in Vermont, in a rural area, I understand. They do have the online option, but there's the Middlebury Institute for International Studies in Monterey, okay? Great area by the ocean, but I'm sure the cost of living is a little bit higher. There's University of Maryland, College Park has a very reputed higher ed admin program. Lots of schools in the DC area. GW has another one, okay? So bottom line, in addition to the academics, faculty, their area of specialization, I mean, ask yourself, what part of the country do you want to be in? Okay, can you see yourself there for 1 to 2 years?
Go ahead, Kate.
Okay, I was going to say, to hop on to this, you know, if you're interested in higher ed, if you're joining a graduate program, that's also a great time to start gaining experience, whether it's a graduate assistantship or just doing like an hourly job. A lot of departments love to hire grad students because we can get a lot of highly skilled workers helping with our office, and then they gain that experience that then they can use to move onwards. It's also great because if you have that experience, you then are making those networks where they might know of a position that's opening and immediately think of, I had this grad student, they would be perfect for it. And, you know, that's a great way to get your foot in the door. And then with the JET alumni scholarships, there are a lot out there that weren't there 5 years ago or even 10 years ago. So there are some schools that are very specific for like international education that offer scholarships, but there are others like Carnegie Mellon's Heinz School or Heinz College at Carnegie Mellon offers a JET alumni scholarship. So that's not necessarily international ed, but that's a great scholarship to get. So as Ned said, if you're not sure, ask. It doesn't hurt. Adam.
And the one thing I was going to add, those were great summaries, was just that being a graduate student is such an excellent time to explore a lot of things and really reach out and seek out mentors, because people sort of recognize that graduate student role as this sort of like, you are someone who is a potential mentee that's looking to grow into the field and is kind of passionate about the topic. Graduate school comes with a lot of rigor and a lot of sort of self-determination. And so you really can take advantage of that role for the usually like 2 years that you're a graduate student, at least if you're earning a master's. So it's a really great time to flourish and sort of develop your professional identity and connect in the profession.
And for my own grad school research phase, I mean, I knew I wanted to go to grad school outside the US. My program, solid 1 year, 5 minutes by the beach, an hour below Sydney, done. And yeah, one of my mentors was also working there, which helped. And yeah, the rest is history.
Oh, and also to tie on to the grad school, I have to throw this in. I don't have my master's. I started working in higher ed first. Again, I got that foot in the door role that I didn't really like, but my university offered free graduate classes. So because I was working, I didn't have to pay tuition. And it took, you know, many years to get a lot of credits, and I never finished, but I am much closer to where I could be to get my master's. So there's also the opportunity, if you start working in a role you don't like, you can take the classes to get your master's, especially if money is an issue, and then move, once you have that master's, into the role that you're looking to enter. Back to Adam.
Okay, so this is going to be about interviewing at universities and what to kind of expect from university culture or higher education culture. So there are some like very basic things to consider, and things have changed a lot. But for example, when we talk about geography, one thing to consider, depending on what you want to accomplish, is, you know, don't shoot for working at Harvard, for example, or in big expensive cities right away. Some of the best advice I ever got was when I was actually in community college in San Francisco. I was told, you know, don't try to start your library career here. There are people way more experienced than you coming here with years of experience. You can't compete. Go work in Dayton, Ohio, and build up your career, and then come back when you have that experience. Plus cost of living issues, things like that. The other thing is different parts of the country could really affect you depending on your own personal identity. I applied for a job in Texas, and my family was very upset with that because they didn't want their gay son working and living in Texas. They're not open to that. And for the record, it was only until 2 weeks ago that it was okay by the federal government to be fired for being LGBT. So, you know, you have to think about that. And even though the law has changed, the attitudes of a campus need to be investigated. If you're not white, if you're not male, if you're not straight, and any number of things, right? You have to figure out like, what is the situation there? when I applied for my job at CU Boulder, I had to look into like, what is the status of like LGBT people on the campus? Is it open? It turns out it's like one of the top 25 most friendly campuses to work on for LGBT people. So I've had great experiences vis-a-vis that. But these are things you have to think about. Like there may be maybe incompatible with your values. When it comes to looking up positions, there are so many different options. There's a job list for every minutia in higher ed of any kind, and they come in all kinds of different varieties. So for example, BCLA is the Black Caucus of the American Library Association. So you should take advantage of that if you're interested in a career in libraries. And they have their own career counseling section. They work with you, all that kind of great stuff. And even within the library world, there's ALA, American Library Association, but then there's ACRL, American College and Research Libraries. And there's subsets within that too for different kinds of academic libraries also. Also, my cat might be making a guest appearance in just a second. But do realize that there's probably a very niche group of people that you can totally connect into on a professional listserv where they make job announcements, all that kind of thing. Usually there's always one for LGBT people, for people who are Black, Latino, Asian, whatever that may be. So just be aware that those support networks are there, and you should absolutely be taking advantage of them if they're available to you. Like you can see with the different acronyms we have here, like these are just 3 examples, but like we could have a Google Doc that was pages and pages of this kind of thing. So make sure that you find the professional like listservs that kind of match you. And then so for the interview itself, some big do's and don'ts and whatnot. So one thing to consider, because I struggled this when I applied and I kind of have seen it. I've been on many interview panels and I've been on the other side of that equation. It's a lot of time and money to hire a new person. You put in hours of reading these applications, and then if people like aren't who they say they are, you're wasting the university's money. They don't like that. And then your name is kind of branded as like somebody to be wary of. But one basic thing to consider is you have the cover letter and your CV. Often in academia, you submit a CV, which can be multiple pages instead of a resume, which is 1 page. So one key concept to keep in mind is a CV is essentially a list of your accomplishments and your job history, but the weight and value of what you did isn't obvious from that. The cover letter will contextualize why the things on your CV matter. And what you want to be able to talk about is not necessarily just what you did, but you want to be able to talk about why it mattered and what the impact of what you did is. And that's not always obvious if you just give someone a detailed CV. So that's what you're trying to create a relationship for. Like think of the JET interviews where the statement of purpose letter told you about their history and things like that. That kind of got you excited about this person being on JET. And this is my cat. So everyone's like squeakers. So she's going to be here for a little bit. And then other things to consider, like know who you're speaking to. So when you apply for a job, you're going to be communicating with somebody in HR. That is always your go-to person to ask questions. And one thing you may want to do is ask them who the chair of the search committee is so that you can address your letter directly to them with the correct title of that person. It's a little thing. It goes a long way if you have a close call between 2 candidates. There's that level of detail and consideration. And while you're at it, why not ask who all of the search committee members are? See who they are on LinkedIn. Look at their professional profiles. That way you know who they are. You know their names before you walk into the room. It's much more sociable. The other thing is formalities. Formalities vary a lot between institutions. So at my university, for example, we take it really seriously that you follow the time limits we give you. I imagine other universities are really similar, but for example, at CU Boulder, there's the interview for our librarians, at least, is an 8-hour day plus dinner. For other teaching faculty, it's usually a 2-day experience. And then for staff, it varies wildly depending on the position and what they're doing. But one thing to keep in mind is we want 30 minutes of your presenting based on a prompt we've given you. There's a 1-hour presentation period, and then the other 30 minutes are for Q&A, and we are really into that Q&A, and we ask really hard questions. Like people just have like whole packets of your like interview application printed out, and they're like pulling up the page like, in your statement on diversity, you said X, Y, Z, and I'd just really like you to expand more on that and how you would solve this problem in society, right? And you're not necessarily expected to give a perfect answer, but people want to hear like a well-rounded and thought out answer. And then the other thing, it's not a bullet point here, but I do want to say that we really value the potential for growth over pure skill, in the sense that if you're difficult to work with but very talented, we're probably not going to hire you. But if you're less experienced but clearly demonstrate a capacity to learn and grow, we're going to be much more interested in that candidate for sure. Then of course, things like follow-up questions. Like you should always have questions for the audience, for your search committee. You will go through, when you do an 8-hour interview, you'll kind of like repeat this process many times over. And then one last piece of advice I'm going to give is also that people love stories. People remember stories. And you are all JET alumni. You have a lot of great stories. And so what you want to do is think about this job interview. So I applied to be a librarian. Well, I was also the librarian for Hyogo AJET. And I had like 2,000 books in my tiny apartment. And you know, you'll usually get a question of like, so how did you become a librarian? Like, how did you get into librarianship? We love that kind of thing in my field. I always want to know the origin story. And I was like, well, when I lived in Japan, I was this volunteer librarian. And so like romance was like in the bathroom and mysteries were under the kitchen sink. And I had like classic literature like in the Genkan. And for some reason, people loved that story. And I was told to retell it multiple times in the day. And so I was like a complete person. I wasn't just an interview candidate. Like people kind of knew me as like a guy who did interesting things, and that makes people more excited to work with you. So think about your really good JET stories or other stories in your life, and then connect them to the job and put them together, because that's what people latch onto and remember really well. If it's just facts and numbers you're giving, that's good, and you should include that. But if you contextualize it as being like a person with a story to tell, that can be really useful. Now, if you're talking to the College of Engineering, they're a bit more dry about that kind of thing. But in librarianship, we love the human story. Like we're all about that. So do think about like the culture of the department or unit you're applying for. Obviously with a job like Ned's or Kate's, like they're gonna really be into that human element as well. And also for the record, there is a USJETAA webinar on marketing your JET experience. So make sure you check that out as well. So that's my advice on interviewing.
Just to add on to geography and culture, please know that your master's degree is also going to be viewed and valued differently depending on the culture and geography. For example, when I got back in the States, you know, JET alum, had a master's degree. I had a mentor who said, listen, on any given day, you're going to be top 15 for any international ed, X, Y, and Z role. Why don't you expand a little bit out west or even south? And similar to what Adam indicated about certain things he had to be mindful of, I mean, I did not feel comfortable applying to roles in certain states, especially in the South. I just had to go with my comfort level. And things worked out with a tiny private liberal arts college in North Carolina. But again, everyone I'm sure wants to be in New York City, Boston, San Francisco, DC. Know that it's an extremely competitive market. Your first role may not be there, but as long as you start your first role somewhere, that's all that matters. My first role was in a tiny, albeit a very wealthy college town of 30,000 people. In retrospect, it's one of the best jobs I've ever had, next to JET, of course. But yeah, it was great. I learned a lot, expanded my portfolio, gained lots of transferable skills, knowledge, and was able to connect the dots to that intended academic advising role in Minnesota. And it's just how things worked out. So in other words, I encourage you all to just be flexible and don't always keep New York, DC, or like any other big city in mind. Look at other areas where it's not as competitive, but given your credentials, given your lived experiences, the quality of life, cost of living, public transportation, whatever's on your ladder of priorities, there are all these pockets of places throughout the country that you'd be even more competitive than just trying to start out in a large, major, extremely competitive city.
And I'm finally going to add about, like, with the JET experience, I know that it's very difficult to put it on your resume, put it on your CV, and kind of explain exactly what you've learned from it. But there is incredible value in keeping it on your resume and CV. I've spoke to some alums who say that, well, they took it off because they don't see how it could help them in their position, or, they didn't want to explain it, or, they didn't feel that they learned a lot from JET. you learn a lot from every position that you do, and you don't know who's going to be reading that resume and cover letter. In my current role, I did not know going in that my my boss, the director of international affairs, was a Jet from '88 to '89. So when I showed up for the interview and we're going over my background and everything, he turned my CV over and said, "I see that you were a Jet." I was a Jet. And that was like, for me, in my comfort level, like I was so nervous about this interview for this position I loved, knowing that, oh, we have this Japan connection, great. And there are a lot of Jet alum who work in higher ed. So keep it on there. We will give you some tips later on. And I know that USJETAA also has information on, you know, how to put your experience into words. So, you know, yeah, keep it on there.
I mean, when you think about it, the essence of the JET program is this cross-cultural communication in the context of getting situated with a role in higher ed. I mean, you're articulating the proposition value you bring to the table. Again, communicating all your earned cultural cred, transferable knowledge and skills.
Right.
So we have a little personal trajectories via emojis. And yeah, let me start. So again, JET program, then Australia, where I went to grad school at the University of Wollongong, graduated, champagne popping, of course, and then jumped on a plane back to the US. And yeah, immediately got situated with a sales associate job just to make ends meet. And that email's there because that's all I was doing. Requesting informational interviews via LinkedIn, directly getting in touch with people when I went to, you know, X, Y, and Z college universities' websites, just trying to pick their brain about, hey, how'd you get situated in your role? What advice do you have for me? All that jazz. Calendar, gotta stay on top of it, okay? Stay organized, figure out when you have interviews, figure out when you have informational interviews, be professional at all times. And that frustrating face is nicely epitomizes what I was also undergoing, because a combination of extreme reverse culture shock, because again, I was away for 6 consecutive years, and then having to readjust to American time, culture, it was rough, I'm not gonna lie. So that, and sometimes, you know, clearly articulating myself in English just wasn't there. that had some funny moments, but yeah, it was really frustrating. But again, I would have all these applications in consideration, would get interview requests, again, jotting it on the calendar, getting prepared, all that. 4-leaf clover is on there because I'm not gonna lie, it takes a little bit of luck. And just like I tell my students, job hunting is one of the very few things I think in life where you simultaneously do and don't have any control. Once you hit that submit button, healthy, positive distractions. Go for a walk, apply for another role, look at, I don't know, videos of golden retriever puppies, like whatever it takes, and then just keep doing it until something works out. And like I said, luck does play into it. And then, yeah, my role as a study abroad advisor started, and that graph, I think, nicely epitomizes my trajectory, because again, it's not a straight line going up. It was JET, then come back to the US, then working as a sales associate to make ends meet. Then after some hustle and bustle, lots of emails, working out, then shifting gears to academic advising, and now I'm in Utah. So far, so great. And a lot of what I do is just listen to students to empower them to navigate all this internship job search process. And of course, work with employers to create and expand their internship model. But a big reason for what I do is because of the incredible mentors I had during my undergraduate experience. I'm still close with my study abroad advisor. And that was a long time ago. Okay, some of my faculty I'm still close with. And I also value reciprocity, and this is my way to pay it forward. Every day I use my, transferable skills from the JET program. And like I said earlier, jumping from one school to another figuring out the culture, the dynamics, the hierarchy, the hierarchies within hierarchies. The advice I have for any aspiring higher ed professionals, whether it's student facing or not, just network. Never hesitate to just go up to anyone, to shoot people a tailor-made text message through LinkedIn. And I'll never forget when I got back in the DC area, this was winter of 2015. I volunteered as the JW Marriott in DC. It was international ed conference. And I would just ask people, what advice do you have for me? I'm an aspiring international ed professional. I'll never forget one individual who I'm still in touch with just said, never hesitate to go up to anyone because they were in your shoes at one time in their life.
Okay. So for mine, it's actually one big circle. We'll start with Japan. So I left JET in 2009, and I took a roundabout way back to the US. I did the Trans-Siberian Railway from Beijing to Moscow. I backpacked around Europe for a month or two, made it back to the United States with no job. The 2008 recession had still going on. No idea what to do, but I was back. And I spent 2 years looking for a job. I did work at temp. I was lucky that I grew up in the DC area, so I worked as a JET program assistant for the application processing. And then I would, pop in whenever DC had volunteer events, networked a lot. I tutored Japanese students in English. So I did a lot of odd jobs in order to keep active, and I applied. I applied for 2 years on many different roles, and I finally got my foot in the door in a small private liberal arts college in Frederick, Maryland, where I started with study abroad, doing advising part-time, and then I got a role in admissions. And through that, I started to develop skills with international advising. Even though I was doing the study abroad piece and helping Americans go overseas, when I, told people I was interested in becoming more involved in international ed, as a full-time position, I got my foot in the door for international immigration advising, and I was given development opportunities to build those skills. Fantastic. I'm now, sending Americans abroad, building the skills to get international students to the United States, seeing the outcome of my work when my students graduate. It was fantastic. And I took those skills and got myself a full-time job at my alma mater in Pittsburgh. So I moved back to Chatham University, where I got my undergraduate degree, where it all started when I had a Japanese roommate my sophomore year. And I am the most cliche story when I talk about international ed. But now I'm that person who is helping students come to the US. Lots of bureaucracy, lots of paperwork, lots of stress in current COVID times. But with a student-facing role, I know the value of international education, and through JET, I could see how I grew as a person. And now I can see it, when I have a student come in as a first-year student to when they graduate, how they develop and how that international experience builds them. And I know that I owe a lot of that to the JET program and how I was able to learn on the job, the cultural communication, navigating different types of relationships, working through language barriers. I learned that all on JET. If I had to give a piece of advice for individuals looking to work in higher ed, what can you do? It would be constantly develop yourself. I was able to get to where I am now by saying I'm interested in developing more international experience in higher ed. And my university paid for training. So even if you're able to start one place or even start in the office you want to be in, if you show that you're willing, you show that you're interested and passionate about gaining more experience, as Adam mentioned earlier, they love development and growth. They want to see you, go from that entry level to a higher role. everybody wants to have qualified individuals. So put yourself out there and constantly work to develop skills.
And so for my history, so JET ended and I was very sad, but I knew it was time to go back to the US. So I went back to my home state of New York, and I basically, this is the beginning of a 2-year period where I had no idea what to do, and I really drifted a bunch. So just a big shrug, and I ultimately just kind of moved to San Francisco because I could. But before I did that, I did actually get my CELTA certificate to teach English. And so in San Francisco, I did teach English again. And actually it was incredibly fun. And I met a lot of really amazing and wonderful people. And it was much more challenging and much more rewarding than JET in a lot of ways. But also at the same time, I had that idea of being a librarian. And so what I did was I went to community college in California because it's super cheap. And it just like, I had to be a resident in California for 1 year, but the moment that happened, I took a ton of community college courses in it. And I realized that that was something I really liked and enjoyed. So I flew back to New York and I went back to my undergraduate university. So I went to SUNY Albany, and I decided I wanted to go back there again. I had professors there who were willing to help me. It's much cheaper than San Francisco. I had a lot of friends there, like a big support network to kind of commit to 2 years of graduate school. It was a really wise decision for a lot of reasons, because the first thing I did when I moved back was I took the civil service exam, and I got a job as a circulation clerk at the public library system in Albany. And that was the beginning of getting hands-on experience. And then the teaching experience in San Francisco and JET really matters for higher ed. People want to hear about like pedagogy. And then what I did was I actually did a really large informational interview in Vermont. I actually went to Middlebury because they have the famous language intensive program over the summer. And so I just kind of reached out to one of the librarians there and said, hey, I'm doing my master's in library science. I used to live in Japan. You have this amazing program that matches so much of like what I'd like to be doing. Would it be possible that we could talk over the phone and you could tell me more about what your day-to-day life is like? Because I don't know, I'm just starting my graduate program. And he was like, oh, why don't you just come up here and you just meet everybody? So he arranged a whole day. I met all the librarians because there weren't too many of them, but all the ones that had some kind of language association. He's like, oh, you can meet the head of like libraries IT. You could set you up with a meeting with the dean, which honestly, like I was kind of unprepared for. I didn't know what kinds of questions to ask, but like usually professionals are aware if you're kind of new to the field that you'll be like that. So there's a level of awkwardness there that's completely fine. It was an incredibly welcoming experience, and it made me feel really good about like the profession. And then with that, what also happened was I got an internship in New York City at NYU with their Japanese studies librarian, which was perfect. And I got to see a lot of interviews happen there for potential candidates at that library. So I got to understand the academic interview experience. I did hands-on things with Japanese books. I had a lot of great like on the ground like core experiences for librarians. So I knew exactly what to expect from a job going forward. And then I also got another internship on top of that where I was telecommuting with a group called the North American Coordinating Council of Japanese Library Resources, which coincidentally is where I met Paige, and we didn't know each other were Jets for like the first 5 years we worked together because for some reason it didn't come up. So yeah, Jets really are everywhere. And thanks for helping fund that position so I could have like a job that related to Japanese libraries back when I was a grad student. And that was like the most important thing I could have done for being very relevant for the position. And I learned actually after my job interview was settled and I was hired that basically I was the only qualified candidate that had applied in what was already a very small pool. So the university was incredibly nervous about finding anybody. And they were like, oh my God, I hope this guy wants this job because he's the only one that can do it. So that was a big relief. But yeah, I flew to Colorado. I did my job interview. I was completely exhausted after a 10-hour interview. And they called me 3 days, unlike Ned's experience, they called me 3 days later to give me the job. And yeah, and then I moved out to Colorado. I've been here 7 years. I'm now a tenured professor and librarian of Japanese and Korean studies. And yeah, this is the career for the rest of my life. And this is my home for the rest of my life. And like, I feel incredibly lucky that all of this worked out. And it really is amazing that it all goes back to being a JET program participant.
One word I think all three of us has have been saying quite a bit is, networking, get mentors. And I just want to mention that interviews, irrespective of how many you apply for, one, you're going to get overlooked. It's just the nature of the beast, okay? You'll get an interview request and they'll already have an internal candidate in mind. But what I always encourage folks to wrap their heads around is that nothing ends. Things just evolve, okay? And interviews, I think, are inherently a form of networking. So personal example, winter of 27, I was interviewing at the University of Utah in the College of Humanities for another role. There was someone on the search committee that I had immediate chemistry with, okay? You can't deny chemistry. When it's there, it's there. And I requested an event debrief, and we stayed in touch. And I got situated with another role in Minneapolis. But again, we stayed in touch. And a couple of months later, she sends me an email saying, hey, new role popping up. Why don't you apply? I did. I'm in my current role, and that individual is my direct supervisor. Funny how things work out, okay? So just because you get overlooked doesn't mean it's over, okay? It's, again, request the event debrief. The worst that can happen is they won't accommodate, then those aren't individuals that are going to be in your network. But if they do, continuously nourish that relationship and, again, see how things organically unfold. And you never know when or how things will unfold, but unless you keep that line of communication going.
And to build off of that, moving forward, so what is some practical advice that we can give you on steps to take when you're looking into working for higher ed? Number one, create realistic and manageable goals and timelines. As many of us, or I think all of us have said, there's usually a gap of time. Higher ed timetables are a little bit different. So, during the academic year, if they have a role that needs to be filled right away, they might fill it quickly. But otherwise, if it's a position that's just opening it up, you might be waiting 2, 3, 6 months from start till finish as they fill that role. Many times it takes a long time. And also with realistic expectations, don't think that, once you get your foot in the door and you get that job that you love, that it's just going to be rainbows and butterflies. There's challenges for every work experience, including those that you love. So reaching out to someone who's already in the role that you want to take and asking them, like, informational interview, can you tell me what your day-to-day schedule looks like? Who do you have meetings with? What are some challenges that you have in the role? But not just challenges, ask them what are the successes? Where have you seen personal growth in the role that you're in? Networking, again, we can't, hype it up enough. And not only networking is like JET alums, though they're great to network with in higher ed, also reach out to universities that you've attended before, your alma maters. Reach out to faculty members. Reach out to friends that, if they've attended a university that you're interested in, see if they can connect you to someone. Resources to be familiar with now. If you are vaguely interested in higher ed, but you're not sure kind of what you want to do, start doing your research right away. Like, find out what the differences are between large public research institution and small community college. If there's a particular role you're looking in, as we said earlier, find out what professional organization works with that role. Find out what 5 professional organizations, are associated with that role, and then start doing your research into what do they do. Is it a benefit to join? Do they have discounts for non-professionals to get experience working with them? Research graduate schools. Get a mentor. This is something where many times young professionals don't necessarily think about mentorship. They think of it as something like, well, when I was an undergrad or when I was younger. Professional mentors are fantastic. And that is also something that, I think people would be flattered if you go up to them and say, you know what, I want your job. Do you want to be my mentor? Do you want to help me, reach the level that you're at? Or even if it's, someone you don't know, but you have, a network together, just reaching out and saying, I would love to get your guidance on how I can improve my own professional development in order to reach the goals that I'm looking into achieving. And then due diligence. You can't know everything. That's the downside. But working in higher ed is constant education, constant development. So things change. It might be slow. It might be completely different from one week to the next. So stay on top of things, especially if you have a particular field. Sign up for listservs, sign up for newsletters, see how the field is developing and changing, reaching out to others to get advising and to have them answer your questions. It's a great way to, again, build yourself, but also stay networked enough that when you want to move around or stay in place, people know what you want to do.
Speaking of networking, I see there are 39 participants here. So by the end of tomorrow, Adam, Kate, and I, unless we're already connected on LinkedIn, should get 39 invites, okay? Start the conversation. And two, we all started pre-COVID.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone, I mean, Kate mentioned 2 years, right?
Yeah.
Pre-COVID. So if you want to, start a career in higher ed, I mean, and you have a master's, 3 things. You got to be more patient, you got to be more resilient, and you got to be a little bit more creative. So in addition to what, we've already been saying and the resources that you'll have access to after this, I mean, think of all the ways that you can leverage technology, because that is going to be the big game changer.
And then one thing I'll add, or 2 things actually. So for mentoring, I have to say it's really quite flattering when people reach out to ask about guidance and advice. Like, it feels really good to be like seen as someone who has something to offer and is like
Feel wanted.
Yeah, right. I mean, one of the most interesting situations was I had a Jet reach out to me through Reddit of all things, and she's like, "Hey, I saw, like, I posted on the Jet subreddit because like every once in a while there's interesting questions that pop up there." And somebody was like, "Oh, I saw that you're like a librarian now, and I've always been really curious about that. I know this is really weird, but can I ask you some questions?" Like, "Oh my God, yeah, I'd love to tell you about my profession." And I have a relationship with that person now. They're wrapping up their time in Hokkaido and coming back to the US. And then also, like, there is a strong desire to pay it forward. I am the recipient of so much good advice from so many talented people that I can't imagine not emulating that and not wanting to do that for my fellow people, especially my fellow Jets. And the one other thing I'd add too about, like, it was something that Kate had said earlier, but like when you get the job and you're like, yes, I did it, it's this huge relief, right? Like stability, career, pay, maybe benefits and retirement and all that kind of thing. But, I remember 2 years into my job, I just realized, like, wow, this is like really hard. It isn't like, hard in the sense that, like, I really have to keep growing and faster than before, not slower. Like, the pace has actually increased for me to maintain like a professional identity where I'm respected by my colleagues. Like, there's actually, like, it is a slower pace, but there is a high intellectual demand that comes with being in higher ed, not so surprising. And it's not the same kind of cutthroat demand you might run into in private business, but people expect you to be growing and excelling, and it's very abstract and self-driven. Because it's not necessarily driven by a profit motive. And that can be really challenging in its own way. But it's been very rewarding too to kind of navigate that and grow through that.
That's one of the many ironies of higher ed. Our policies and practices, they're either outdated, they're slow, but the demographics of the students, I mean, diverse communities breed diverse issues, both invisible and visible. Unless you're up on the literature, reading various scholarly articles or even blogs. I mean, it's just, you have to stay on top of who you're endeavoring to serve and serve well.
All right, so I know we're at time and we still have Q&A, so apologies for running a bit long. I know in higher ed and with JET alumni in particular, we love to share our advice and we love to tell our stories. So now is time for questions. Casey, do you want me to send it back to you?
Yeah, I will go ahead and, so we've gotten quite a few questions, and there's been a lot of really great links that have been shared in the chat as well for resources to connect to other JETs in higher ed, as well as, you know, other resources. So I'm gonna go ahead and share those out too when I send the webinar out, and as well as links to other webinars that are on related topics. But I'm gonna go ahead and jump into questions. We've gotten quite a few. Two related questions, one from Sheila, who asked, any tips on navigating a career change in higher education during these very uncertain economic times due to COVID? And then another one from Erin, if you guys have any insight on how higher education hiring landscape has been affected, especially for student-facing roles due to COVID. So anyone can jump in if you have any insight on that.
I'm not going to lie, it's a challenge, and right now it's particularly difficult. A lot of universities who are tuition driven, meaning we rely on students to have money in order to have staff and faculty, have had some difficulties the past 6 months, whether, you know, they've had to cut programs or furlough. You know, I'm very fortunate at my university that hasn't happened, but it is something that is a challenge. And in terms of student facing, that's the one piece no university wants to cut. They want to, you know, make their students feel comfortable. They want them on campus if they're able to, but they also want them to be safe. So I would say post-COVID time, you're going to have to do a lot more research, and it might be very specific, where you're looking at a very specific school. Are they hiring? It might be, you know, casting that net wide, where if you're looking for a role in residence life, as an example, there might not be any universities in your area that are hiring residence life, but a university 3 states away is desperate to have people because for some reason their people are leaving. With higher ed, there's a fair amount of turnover anyway. I know people even at my university who got other jobs and left during COVID. And so now we have, you know, holes in the staff hierarchy, which we don't know if they'll be filled in the next year. So I think just doing a lot more research, and in terms of like doing that, you know, networking and reaching out, asking others, do you know of any roles? Do you know of universities that are still hiring? Is a great way to work post-COVID.
If you can weather this, you're lucky and you're privileged. It's always easier to transition out of a role during stable times versus chaotic, unpredictable times. The second question was what, Casey? How has student-facing interaction changed in light of COVID? Is that right?
The second question, what are some tips into, yes, how has the hiring landscape been affected, especially the student-facing roles?
Lots of hiring freeze, so that's one.
Yeah.
2, I mean, who knows when that will end, right? And 2, even if you were lucky enough to change roles, I mean, online boarding is not going to be the same. Most likely it'll be over Zoom. In the College of Humanities, there's myself and 15 other academic advisors. 2 of them, they were able to get onboarded right before the hiring freeze. I've never physically met them.
Mm-hmm.
They've never even been to campus. They don't even know where their office is. So if you start a new role, the likelihood of you starting everything via Zoom is pretty high. Engagement is different because, again, part of that onboarding experience is just seeing your physical office environment, seeing personalities. What you can grasp from like physically seeing them in front of you is very different in that Zoom medium. It's just not the same. So I've been telling folks, you know, I would hate to be a incoming first year, first semester student. I'd hate to be a student that just graduated and someone that's starting a new role, because the likelihood of onboarding over Zoom is pretty high. And that's just is a very different kind of engagement than what it would be if you were to like physically go into an office environment.
I'll be relatively quick. So universities do still hire for essential positions. Those hire skills though, so not on the entry level side. That being said, I would anticipate when we get to the other side of this that there's going to be a flurry of kind of like temporary positions where they need people to deal with like backlogs of different things. Like our library has been shut for 4 or 5 months now. We have thousands of books that we haven't been able to process that are piling up in a warehouse. Another example of like a kind of job you might not expect is we're part of the Google Books project, which is on hold at the moment, but we were hiring Google Books like drivers and transport people. So, you know, very easy to access job that honestly had pretty good pay and like good benefits. So it's worth like scoping out like university portals and seeing what's available. And then student wise, you know, I'm going to be teaching a first year experience course with a class of 20 to 40 students in the fall, all online. So I really have to know how to use Zoom, and luckily I've had a lot of experience so far, but also using lots of other digital tools, curating digital content for students to access. A big part of my job as a librarian is like digital resource guides that students connect with, like using ebooks and our digital databases is much more important now than it was before. So knowing how to sort of create experiences for people online and create digital content is going to be really important.
Some great insight. And I feel like it's going to be challenging for everyone who's on the job hunt, no matter what you're going into. Moving along, these questions are specifically for Ned and Kate. Jonathan says, did you start and study abroad because you found it an easy way in, or was it just that that was what was available during the job search? And then Michelle had a similar question about study abroad. She says that I'm in a higher ed student affairs master's program right now. There's not really opportunities for study abroad. Practicums at my institution. I heard study abroad is a hard functional area to get into. What are some tips in getting into this area?
Kate, you go first.
That is true. Study abroad is difficult to break into, and this is where looking at geography and type of university can be a benefit. I got my break into study abroad because it was a small school, and I was cheap. They didn't want to pay for a professional, but here was someone who had international experience, who had programming experience, and was willing to work part-time doing all of the study abroad. That said, I wasn't in that role very long, but I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And I loved working with my students, and I helped it, like, it got me the development I needed to get where I am now. I think there is a lot of luck. Again, you're going to be applying to a lot of roles. In terms of study abroad forecast in the future, right now it is difficult because most universities that I know of have postponed or canceled their education abroad programs for the fall, maybe also for spring 2021. But that doesn't mean that they're not going to come back. I've seen a lot of programs that have adapted. Adaptability is one of your #1 skills in working in higher ed, where they're networking with international universities and doing a virtual study abroad. Or, you know, you weather it out, there'll be opportunities because students still want to gain this experience. But I think good advice that I can give is, you know, reach out to other professionals in the study abroad or education abroad field, gather information, see if you can gain experience as an intern or as a volunteer in offices if they're opening. I know you said your practicum is kind of limited right now. Anything helps to, you know, put it on your resume. You know, I wouldn't necessarily tell people to look for programs that are desperate for hiring, but if it gets your foot in the door, it works. Ned?
So before I got situated with that study abroad advisor role, I applied to 64 positions. So yeah, and this is on top of, you know, extreme reverse culture shock. I was going through like 2-3 interviews a month. And with every interview, I viewed it as like an athlete. You just get better. Just demonstrate your capacity to perform, okay? And interviews, I love interviews. I view it as the ultimate form of like political theater. Anyway, so yeah, I wanted to break into international ed, student facing within higher ed. I never worked as one, but all the takeaways from my JET experience and what really made me stand out was what Kate indicated earlier, due diligence. I read via Google Scholar quite a few articles about international ed or the Journal of Studies of International Ed. What are the trends? What are the issues for specific demographics? How are the program models evolving? And I was able to tie that with my narrative and clearly articulate the added value that I can bring to the table for that office and college. And clearly things worked out. So yeah, international ed in particular tends to be glorified. Ooh, you get to jump on a plane, travel to these countries, evaluate programs. Yes, there is that. And I was extremely privileged to go to Denmark and to evaluate a program, and Ecuador, okay? I also worked at a very affluent private liberal arts college that money was not an issue, okay? But yeah, anytime you want to jump roles or institutions, it's not as easy as trying to move within an institution. But again, I've been extremely lucky. Yes, I've also put in a little bit of effort in my own due diligence. So again, go from North Carolina to Minnesota, then academic advising, and then to Utah. I mean, I'm literally carving a line through the US, but it is what it is. And again, like I said, I value reciprocity, and this is one of the ways that I want to pay it forward.
That's some great advice. Sort of piggybacking off of that, do you guys have any recommendations for, you know, technical skills that you should have, including like Google Analytics, Canva, TDS? And also from the same question from the same person, Caroline, what advice do you have about negotiating salary and benefits?
Yeah, I'll step into that. So what the skills you'll develop will vary quite a bit based on the position, of course. But one thing I would say, so this will sound really silly, but get better at Excel and like Google Sheets, like know how to actually use formulas, because the amount of time you can save and the amount of, frankly, minds you can blow with that efficiency is really like helpful. Like I do this at my job now. Like I'm known as the, like part of my research is workflow analysis. So I've sort of become the colleague that can look at how people do their jobs and make it like faster. So a lot of my research is focused on removing the parts of your job that don't require human decision making, so you can focus on the parts that do require human intellect, judgment, analysis, that kind of thing. And so, as silly as it sounds, getting really good at Excel can do amazing things for you. And with that too, I would definitely encourage like some amount of knowing how to code, even if it's just knowing HTML and CSS for websites. But if you can do maybe even, if you want to be a little more ambitious, if you even know a bit of Python script, that can be really helpful. And there's plenty of online courses. There's like Code Academy, Learn to Code, all this kind of stuff. I happen to use a scripting language called AHK, which is called AutoHotkey, and that's what I use at my job. But I had never thought that I was going to be doing coding and programming as part of my work. But I think that even in what might be thought of as like an entry-level office job, a little bit of know-how with like Excel automation or Excel formulas can make the job so much easier and so much more manageable. Like usually if you're doing something really repetitive, there's a very good chance that, you know, not even learning to code, like Excel can do it much more efficiently. You just don't know the formula or the feature in the program that does that thing. So assume that that feature exists. So I think that's really good entry-level advice. But I think that, I mean, you can spend a lifetime learning Excel. Like it's not silly that there are college courses in it. It really is a powerful program. And I think that's one of the more accessible ways you can really demonstrate your ability to deal with a lot of work.
And I think that's more universal. Like Excel, I know so many offices across campus, whether it's HR, admissions, international ed, or faculty that use it. One thing is most universities or institutions use different programs. So you might have background in one program and you get plonked down in a university who has a program that's 30 years old and it's more band-aids than function. That can happen. So trying to do, if you go to the interview, ask them what programs they use. They might have information. Do your research on what are the most common ones. So is the university a banner system? Are you going to be using Slate or Teradata or different programs like that? One thing that I found very interesting is we use a lot of Microsoft Office products. I'm familiar with it, but my work study students, freshmen and sophomores, have never used Microsoft products. They only use Google. So if I tell them, put together an Excel sheet using Excel, I then have to show them how to put together the Excel sheet using Excel. So, familiarize yourself with a variety of programs.
So in addition to all the software bits, email etiquette, like it's mind-boggling to see how many people are not familiar with that, okay? Because I can usually tell within like 5 seconds whether or not this person actually took this particular engagement, albeit in the online medium, seriously or not, okay? Do they have the right name, title, all that? Are you writing
don't start an email with "hey."
Oh, geez. Or like, yes, I can go on. But again, it goes back to formalities. Higher ed is a very conservative, formal industry, okay? Email etiquette matters. Some faculty, if they want to get really picky in particular, they'll take offense with you not addressing them as doctor, blah, blah, blah. We all roll our eyes, but it is what it is. But again, you got to navigate those politics and dynamics. But again, be mindful of how to, request informational interviews. Because again, in order to be taken seriously, you got to take yourself seriously.
Yeah, be respectful of asking for people's time. And one thing with the titles, it's funny because I don't have a PhD, but I will get emails addressed as Dr. Lisbon. And right away I'm put off because I know that the person hasn't really looked into anything about me. So, it works against you in that way. Like being a professor doesn't mean you have a PhD. Having doctor means you have a PhD. To speak to salaries, my experience has been that it's less negotiable than what you might run into in a private business. Usually, departments are constrained by pretty limited budgets. It's not like they just have extra money lying around, but I would venture to guess maybe in a smaller private liberal arts college, that's a different dynamic. But in a big state school, those budgets are pretty well laid out. There is some room I've seen in the past, and very often. So for example, in my field, Associated College and Research Libraries publishes like a table of what you should be making based on years of experience. And that resource probably exists in whatever field it is you're interested in. And that's a really good source to go to kind of determine like, okay, I think that I should be about here. And then you can know if you're getting lowballed or highballed. Keep in mind that $50,000 a year in Ohio is very different than $50,000 a year in New York City, right? Worlds apart. So you could actually get paid more in a place, but it could actually be a pay loss because of cost of living expenses. So that kind of thing. Sometimes you're really lucky with a place like Columbia. They own a lot of real estate, and so you can get subsidized housing by being an employee at a place like Columbia. Depends on the position, right? Not every position is going to be offered that. But keep in mind that those kinds of things can exist. I took advantage of faculty and staff housing here at CU Boulder when I first moved here. And that really kind of gave me an inexpensive way to live in an expensive area to kind of figure out what to do next. So there can be like non-salary perks. And, if you can't do salary, maybe you might have some wiggle room to ask for like more vacation days, things like that. But it really depends on the institution. My experience is that there's not a lot of wiggle room, but I think that there are probably other experiences at other institutions.
And I think in terms of benefits, it is worth it to look and see. If you are, you get to the interview stage, see if you can get a copy of what the packet looks like, because it might be that you're taking a pay cut, but the medical insurance is better. And that might be something that, you need. Or is it vacation? Is it retirement? Those are things that I didn't really consider when I first got in. And now like I look at that a lot if I'm, looking at other positions. And I will, add on to Adam about cost of living is very different. So depending on where you're looking, it might not seem like a lot, but it's more than enough to live in that area, or it might seem like a lot and it's not a lot to live in that area.
When I had to think about salary negotiations for my current role, I mean, one big thing was public transportation for me. One, Salt Lake City, very reliable, frequent. It's also the bus and trains. It's free for all University of Utah employees. I don't own a car. I don't drive. Okay, that's a huge game changer. University of Utah also has, I believe, the most generous retirement of any institution in the US. That was also huge, okay? So yeah, please don't focus on just the net salary, the figure. Think of it in like the complete package, the medical, the dental, the retirement contribution, what other perks like commuter discounts on public transportations, gym benefits.
Tuition remission.
Yeah.
Huge.
For your kids.
Exactly. If I wanted to, I could probably get another master's, but I'm too lazy for that, so it's probably not going to happen. But again, plenty of other benefits.
And I will add that in my interview, there was a specific period of time there where they went over medical and retirement benefits. We actually sat down and went through that together because that was meant to entice me to stay.
Okay, those are some great pieces of advice, and feel like very, very practical when thinking about a new position. Since we're sort of running quite over on time, I'm going to just do one last question, and I would encourage everyone to, reach out to our speakers. You can add me, you can add all of them on LinkedIn. If you ever need resources, please feel free to reach out to USJETAA, and we can definitely point you in the right direction. So one last question for everyone. What is one thing that you think helped you to get into your current position, and maybe one piece of advice that you would like to leave everybody with?
I would say, so for me, if I think about like why I have this job that I have now, it really goes back to honestly my mentors and like being willing to reach out and I think that the piece of advice that I would really give is like assume that it's possible. Don't just write it off. Like assume that you can do it, because it's so silly. Like if you don't ask, you don't know. But like I kept asking and people kept saying yes. And if I hadn't, which is actually a really valuable lesson I learned on JET, because my philosophy on JET was say yes to anything within reason. And that's how I ended up hitchhiking or ending up at unusual temples or spending the night with a family who had a private onsen on their property, right? And that's some of my best stories. It's true too when you're kind of like building up to a career, like just reaching out to an organization saying like, hey, I'm new in the field and I'm really interested in gaining experience. Would you be willing to talk to me about this thing? Or are there any like entry-level positions that I should be exploring, or save that question for when you're actually talking to somebody face-to-face and you've built up rapport with them, because they'll be much more amenable. I do feel like sometimes JETs don't actually utilize their JET alumni network nearly enough. We quite literally are everywhere, so you should be applying that. And I mean, JETs are always so friendly towards other JETs, so I don't know why you wouldn't sort of like look in a region and sort of see if there's a JET working in the organization and reach out to them and to ask them questions like, what is it like there? What's the possibility? What's the situation? It's such a great network that we have, and I don't always see people fully leverage it. So that's my advice.
I'm going to go with like, what skill do I think was the most important to get where I am is adaptability. That I think in life has been the most important skill, whether it is, going into the classroom for the first time and trying to figure out where you sit down and who to talk with to make friends, or, getting on a plane and going to a country where you don't speak the language to live for a year and teach junior high school. If you're able to do that, you really are able to do anything. And so working at a university is full of those challenges. But if you think back of when you were a student and remember, the people who helped you and encouraged you, and trying to like keep that mindset when you're working with students or working with colleagues, it's a great way to continue to develop, and adaptability will always assist you. Some advice for JETs. I'm actually going to use a quote that Adam gave when we were preparing this webinar is, the skills you develop on JET won't get you the job. The skills you developed on JET will help you excel at the job. And I think that that's entirely 100% correct. I didn't learn adaptability on JET, but I gained so much experience that I excelled at it. And now, you know, I don't blink if I have to go into a classroom and there's students from countries that I'm not familiar with, because I know that I'll be able to interact with them and hopefully help them out to have a great experience in the United States. Yeah.
I think one thing that's really helped me is this genuine curiosity. So 2015, 2016, I was trying to leave North Carolina and I had 28 interviews. And I have this joke, I find out about jobs even before Google does, okay, simply because of networking. Just being genuinely curious, like, how did you get there? What were your challenges? How did you overcome them? And again, when people can pick that up and they're just not viewing you as someone just asking for something, the dynamic, the engagement just evolves to a very different level, okay? And the advice I would give to anyone is never prepare for anything, over prepare. And that may include something like memorizing the damn website, okay? Because again, establishing those common denominators and throwing out things that other people may not be mindful of. Hey, the mission and value statement on your website really spoke to me because of X, Y, and Z. I've lived it. You know, I'm curious about where you see your office 3 to 5 years from now. Again, going back to what Kate said, due diligence, just outwork your competition, because again, in light of what's going on, there is going to be a lot of applicants for any number of student-facing, non-student-facing, even basic entry-level roles. And my big thing is just be persistent, be consistent.
Just some great pieces of advice, and I think we'll leave everybody with those pieces of advice. Again, feel free to reach out to all of us, and I would definitely encourage you to follow USJETAA on all of our social media so that you can find out about these events in the future. I want to thank Ned, Kate, and Adam for being speakers today. I think this was wonderful. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day wherever you're located. And thanks again.